Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. With the NATO Summit underway in The Hague, leaders are set to pledge a historic defense spending increase, but their European agenda faces unpredictable disruption as U.S. strikes on Iran shift attention and test alliance unity. What will this mean for NATO's credibility, its support for Ukraine, and Europe's own strategic direction? Joining us is Dr. Marek Madej from University of Warsaw, a specialist in strategic and transatlantic security policy. How's sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Welcome.
So one of the kind of most significant announcement out of this NATO summit is perhaps the pledge to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. How ambitious is this goal, and do you see any hurdle when it comes to actually reaching that number?
Yes, it's very ambitious. So I can see some difficulties or problems which could happen in the road to achieve it. Because the deadline is 2035, so it's a decade. But nevertheless, we talk about increase which is more than doubling, and in many cases, or in case of some countries, it's even more like 3 times more than they have. So even the problem with not only finding money, but even to spend them wisely could be an issue. But what we have to remember is that the threshold or the benchmark of 5% is somehow divided in that sense that 3.5% should be spent on so-called core defense tasks like buying equipment, financing soldiers, training them, and so on. And 1.5% of this overall 5% should be spent on defense-related issues. That is, things like building roads or ports, which are relevant for mobility of NATO forces within European theater and so on, or some investments in science and in research, or some investments in overall training and resilience of society. So it means that the money could be spent also on many things which are not obviously related to defense.
All right, so there's a little bit of breakdown there. Like I mentioned, perhaps a road, logistic, ports, these can also contribute to that 5% and make it so that it is probably a little bit more realistic than some people might assume. Now, there are some countries that are not fully on board with this. Spain, for example, are quite reluctant in joining this initiative. Do you think that they'll eventually kind of be back in the fold, or do you see some disunity going on here?
Well, I think that we will have a lot of discussion during the next decade over that issue, what is or what should not be counted as spending, and to what degree achieving 5% is the goal in itself, or something which should serve a goal, which is simply make NATO and European allies especially more able to defend themselves. By that, I want to say simply that we cannot think about 5% as something which is absolutely necessary, because if you achieve goals of your development of your forces without achieving, in some cases, without getting to 5% by some countries, it could work as well. The more important is to have a capability to fight or efficiently and to defend the countries efficiently, not so much that all 32 countries will have that 5%. And Spain arguments have some logic, because, as I said, it's very often the problem how to spend that money effectively. And 5% was, let's say, said because it is catchy, not because it was calculated very precisely that 5% is absolutely necessary. And also, we have to take into account that the problem is rather which countries would not make it. Because if you have small countries, their overall input into the budget of NATO is small, so it is not so risky for the whole adventure. In case of big countries, when they are lagging behind, then we have problems simply because it's a much bigger deficiency and much bigger lack in capabilities of NATO if big countries are not managing enough.
Right, that's a very good point. The 5% number, even though catchy, it does sound a little bit arbitrary, and it is very important how these funds are being allocated, not just throwing them somewhere and say that we have spent enough money. Now, another very interesting question that is cropping up recently is, of course, the U.S. response to the tension in the Middle East, and though the bombing of several Iranian nuclear sites has called into question some of the unity within the alliance. Analysts are saying that the fact that the U.S. bypass any kind of military partners, be it NATO, it also signifies that they are more and more detached from the military alliance known as NATO. Do you think that there is a risk that we might see a less engaged U.S. and hence making NATO a less reliable alliance going forward?
Well, I think that there is such a risk, or I would not even call it a risk, rather simply a process that will happen. But it doesn't have to be necessarily linked to current events in Middle East. Of course, there are some kind of manifestation of the problem in that sense that Americans are acting unilaterally with no consultation with allies. But on the other hand, in this particular case, it was not necessarily something that NATO has to deal with. So it does not mean that for NATO, the behavior of US in context of Middle East confrontation between Israel and Iran is something that shows, let's say, reluctancy of the U.S. to cooperate with NATO. Some people could say even that the Americans supported an ally, so it's a sign for the others allies that they will be supported as well. The problem is rather simply that attention of the U.S. is going more to the Pacific area or to America itself. Depends if we are talking about isolationist part, let's say, of American administration or more Pacific-oriented part of American administration. But nevertheless, it is a trend which is not with Trump. It started earlier. And we have to deal with that as a European. Partially, that's why Trump pushes so hard for bigger European spending, to make Europeans more capable to do a lot of things, maybe not alone, but with lower U.S. engagement. And in long term, it makes sense, but it also means that the result will be whatever will happen, the result will be the alliance in which U.S. is playing less central role than it was in the past. So especially in the short term, it will mean some decrease, maybe not serious, but decrease in actual military capabilities if Americans won't be so engaged as they were in the past. So it's a more problem how to manage the process, not thinking about it as a threat and a risk, because it's simply maybe not inevitable, but something which has to happen to some degree, and we need to, and probably if everything works fine in that sense that Europe step in, spend more, and be more effective, and Americans will not act in a very hostile way, will not withdraw too fast, will not reduce their engagement, no matter what's the condition on the ground, let's call it that way, that's what Europe is ready for, then it could make an alliance even more effective, more balanced. So.
All right, so there's probably two sides of this as well. And like you mentioned, this kind of analysis of U.S. engagement in the Middle East is rather more of a manifestation of the trend than kind of a turning point. Do you see that this is also going to be the same when it comes to how U.S. approached the Russia-Ukraine issue going forward as well? The United States have already been pulling back, or is the diverting of attention to the Middle East kind of is there a cause and effect between the two, or is it already that we're seeing a pulling back of America from the affairs between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think that, first of all, decrease in interest in Ukraine-Russia conflict in the U.S. was manifested much earlier. We had it since the very beginning of Trump administration that they would like to reduce their support to Ukraine, and behavior of U.S. president especially, but also vice president, in context of position towards Russia and so on, was at least ambiguous on some occasion to what exactly is the main goal of the U.S. So again, I don't see the close relation between that things and things which happen in Middle East, where, by the way, to some degree, we could have an impression that it was more decision of Netanyahu and Israel to act like they did, and therefore Americans had to follow, or they at least decided to follow. So I don't see the direct relation here. And in context of Russia and Ukraine, we already know that Americans will be less engaged. Peace efforts made by Trump were rather unsuccessful, or at least they did not reach any conclusion. But it does not mean that Americans will withdraw totally their interest or attention to in this context, and therefore I think that there is also a possibility that maybe after initial, maybe not failures, but lack of success, here will be more, let's say, agreed position together with allies what to do. And also, as allies, we know that now we have to take bigger burden in context of Ukraine. On the other hand, it's simply our interest to support Ukraine. So I think that in majority of European states, there is an acceptance of reality and the need of doing it. What is also, it's rather a more expectation of more, let's say, coordinated approach from the US, which is a bit hard to assess to what degree we could expect that it will be more coordinated. But after, let's say, initial, as I said, lack of success, I got a feeling, or I at least hope that Americans and American administration will be more cooperative with Europeans on that issue.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.